Greetings and welcome to today's seminar on instructional leadership. Early research on instructional leadership has its origins from the USA during the 1960s, whereby various researchers such as Gross, Harriet, and Bridges laid the groundwork for subsequent research to take place. I provided here a global map and have just put some pins here to sort of demonstrate where a majority of the literature has come from the 80s to the early 90s. And those countries include Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the USA, and the UK. It wasn't until the mid 90s where researchers really started to call upon for more cross-cultural studies and the diversification of educational leadership knowledge base as well. And so in the 2000s, the literature and research was complemented by studies from Asia, Africa, Europe, and also Oceania as well. And I guess the positive to this is that it resulted in the global adoption of instructional leadership, particularly as a key dimension of policy and practice within the school administration. One thing that I found very interesting in the literature in preparation for this assessment was understanding that majority of the studies and literature is westernized and based on schools within Western nations. So it's quite interesting to see some scholars sort of raising the concerns for the context in which instructional leadership is practiced. So to understand, I guess, the definition from literature as far as what is this model of leadership, I thought it would be appropriate to have a look at what some scholars think and then to have a look at a perspective from a deputy principal in Queensland. So to start off with, Leithwood and Montgomery are two education researchers, and they stated in the 80s that instructional leadership was generally conceived to be a unitary role of the elementary school principal. And I found this to be very interesting because in a majority of the research journal articles that I was reading, particularly from the 60s, 70s, 80s, even into the 90s, a lot of what came through from the scholars' perspectives was there was a huge emphasis and focus on, I guess, the principal as the unit of analysis in the studies relating to school leadership. So it's been quite enlightening to see that journey as far as our research is concerned, and the perceptions from the researchers as well. In that it's becoming more and more clear that instructional leadership can be enacted by others in addition to the principal and senior leaders, which is a positive. Philip Hallinger says here in this quote, I'll just read the second half in the interest of time, but the emphasis on school improvement as they were focused on curriculum and instruction. So instructional leaders were goal-orientated as a result of emphasizing curriculum and instruction. And I think this definition still holds true to this day. Some core elements of instructional leadership, I've amalgamated the work of Hallinger, Murphy, and Robinson, and it really boils down to these 5 key points. Defining shared expectations, resourcing strategically, managing the instructional program, promoting a positive school learning environment, and also developing leadership skills and knowledge. So in closing, as far as our range of definitions from literature is concerned, I wanted to showcase an opinion from a deputy principal in Queensland.
Instructional leadership to me is recognising that the skills and knowledge are in the room. It's embedding processes, frameworks to help leverage those strengths in staff. For me as an instructional leader, it's about working alongside those teachers, teacher aides, all your staff, and ultimately making sure the bulk of your conversations are around teaching and learning.
And so what I really liked from that perspective was just about the emphasis on instructional leadership being a leadership model that needs to be practiced by all school leaders. And why that is because in all school leaders doing that, it's essentially going to drive the schools towards excellence, which is the end goal here. Of all the instructional leadership models that are out there in the literature and in the research, out of Murphy, Weber, and Hallinger's models, I particularly like the framework that Hallinger has put together. And the reason for that is he's got 3 dimensions here, And within those three dimensions, there's 10 instructional leadership functions that you can use as a framework to help guide you in your practice. And out of the three models that I was comparing as well for this assessment, I went with this particular instructional leadership model because it's also been empirically tested. Now, a case study that I found that sort of exhibited an evidence-based instructional leadership approach was based in Victoria, Australia, and it was done in 2012. Despite the fact that the study was incomplete at the conclusion of the study, there were still some positive uptakes on using this approach because there was improvements in teacher practice and also the ability of staff to function as an effective learning community. So just having a look here, the issue here was their results were low. They were below state average for VCE and NAPLAN. So what the school or principal team wanted to do was put the emphasis on focusing on support action learning on feedback. And I've listed the strategies, some of the strategies there, but I wanted to particularly focus on strategy number 3. And I think this rings true to the model of instructional leadership, which was work with key leaders. So essentially, what they did was they restructured the teams, and instead of having the high school operate in their key learning areas, they named it learning teams and had the staff congregate for their regular meetings. They also gave the leaders of these learning teams more time to plan and prepare. And what I liked here too is that we saw the model of instructional leadership shine through in that there was regular meets between the learning teams leaders and the principal teams to check on progress, to check on to ensure that that was actually happening, and also to check on the implementation of the strategy. And how this really shined through as far as as far as the groundwork was concerned, those team leaders then were tasked with visiting the classrooms of members of their team to provide regular feedback and to also check in on their goals with each teacher, So I thought this was a really positive way of using the model in a very unique way. As far as features of the model is concerned, the features include the following. And these features have been extracted directly from the 10 functions of Hallinger's instructional leadership model. The strengths of the model. There are so many strengths. So these include, but are not limited to, achieving the company's goals, providing support to staff, increasing teacher capacity, providing staff with support, building a culture of collaboration, providing structure in the work environment, building a culture on evidence-based decision making, which is quite critical. And another strength of the model is that it can enact positive change within learning outcomes as well. Some limitations here, as per Elliott and Hollingsworth's report, was that there can be limitations to school principals' time and capacity. So particularly if it's a school or even a small school where there isn't a specific instructional leader and that falls on the shoulders of a principal, if they are limited in their time due to their managerial part of their role, it can become quite difficult to really effectively use this model within the school. The next dot point speaks to principals failing to recognize that instructional leadership is actually a core part of their role. And according to a study that I was reading in preparation for the assessment by John Hattie and Vivian Robinson, a key finding that they found in their research was that the principals that are in schools where they're seeing improvement in performance, they were the principals that were displaying more frequent direct instructional leadership behaviors. So we know from the research that if you want to see your school improving as far as performance is concerned, you must be able to move through this limitation and proactively take on the role as an instructional leader as well as the principal. Lastly, another limitation of this model is it's dependent on skills and attitude of the leader. And sometimes in schools, based on, I guess, seniority and experience, some staff members get certain roles based on that. And I guess a limitation is if you don't have the right skills and the right attitude, it can be quite hard to really execute the functions of this model. Um, so just having a look at the barriers and the enablers. The barriers here are quite straightforward. So some of the barriers could be it requires high skill and knowledge. So if you were thrown in the deep end to be an instructional leader, it would be quite overwhelming because there's quite a number of areas that you have to cover as far as knowing the curriculum inside and out for all KLAs, staying abreast with policy changes and things of that nature, um, being highly knowledgeable in terms of teaching strategies. So assuming the instructional leader would be somebody that's highly experienced, which leads me to my second point. And then the third one would be another barrier could be lack of support. An enabler of this. So some elements that could help in enabling this model of leadership could be investing in ongoing development in teaching expertise for all staff and leaders. I think that's a really key one here. And unfortunately, in a lot of schools, I guess, particularly in the climate of COVID, it's been quite difficult to do that simply because, when you have staff not in, a lot of staff are using their admin periods to cover collapsed classes and things of that nature. So I guess maybe that could also be a barrier too. Um, Upskilling management is also a big one. So investing in developing the educational leadership of current and emerging leaders, that's huge. Another enabler to help this model work successfully is to also delegate tasks. So sort of encouraging on that distributive style of leadership, but delegating tasks so that the load is evenly distributed. And in investing in training staff, more and more staff are learning how to become instructional leaders as well. In reference to my own analysis of my leadership style and strength, I would say I am democratic in my style of leadership. I like to actively involve team members in the process of problem solving, but also just making their perspectives and input feel valued and heard. I'm a big collaborator and I work well in team settings, and I feel this is because I make people feel that they can trust and rely on me as well. And another strength of mine is that I make people feel engaged and valued. So furthermore, I believe that the instructional leadership model is a successful model of leadership to utilize within a school setting, as it engages members of staff to work alongside one another to provide support and guidance in establishing best practices in teaching. Thank you so much for listening.